This week, I'm joined by Sean Kelly, who is a professor of philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness at the California Institute of Integral Studies. In this episode, we discuss his book, Becoming Gaia, on the Threshold of Planetary Initiation, alongside discussions on climate change, the work of Bruno Latour, Gaia, integral philosophy, and more. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you would like to support Hermitix and gain access to some exclusive content, then please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Sean Kelly, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here, James.
We're going to be discussing your book, Becoming Gaia, on the Threshold of Planetary Initiation, which is one of the best subtitles for a philosophy book I've read in recent years. I think it's fantastic. This book is about 200 pages long, and it's one of those texts which is positively, I've described a few texts like this, but positively dense in the amount of ideas that are in it in a really good way. It for its size, it really packs a punch. Now, I was trying to think about, the typical, what is your book about before we begun? And I could say, well, it's about this notion of Gaia. It's about nature. It's obviously about the ongoing climate crisis from a philosophical or a sort of a philosophy of nature or an integral philosophical angle. But it's also inclusive of big history, the axial ages theory of Karl Jaspers, transpersonal psychology, and some religious stuff in there as well. So to say what this book is about, I am going to hand this over to you, Sean, and say, what is this book about?
Oh, James, I was hoping that you would be able to tell me. No, you're right. I guess the soul of the book is an intuition, a conviction, a felt sense that won't go away, that not only the human species, but the life of this planet is at a critical phase shift, mutation to something completely other that hasn't been witnessed in its 4.6 billion year history. I mean, I guess we could point to similarly qualitative, momentous thresholds, the birth of life. When the ball of molten rock that was our Earth somehow miraculously began to self-organize and produce the first living cells, which relatively quickly became a super thin layer surrounding the planet, the biosphere. It took quite some time for these single cells to get together, complexify, and become complex organisms, and eventually give birth to the biosphere as we've known it. So that was equally momentous, obviously. We could point possibly to the emergence of reflexive, self-conscious, symbolically articulating forms of life. There's some debate as to whether or not humans were the first, but certainly once humans emerged, maybe some 300,000 years ago, but possibly some of our hominin ancestors, as long as 1 million years ago, or perhaps even further, who were able to generate symbolic representations, symbolic embodiments of their felt experience and what to them was the meaning of being a living member of this living Earth. That was an equally momentous mutation. So we seem to be at a similar phase shift now, and it has at least two sides. On the one hand, it seems to represent the birth of a new kind of consciousness, of the same qualitative order as the emergence of self-reflexive consciousness itself, whether that was 300,000 or 1 million years ago. But on the other hand, it's accompanied by, and arguably even being catalyzed by, an existential threat, not only to our own species, but to the very fabric of complex life in which we're embedded on a planetary scale. So this is what the main theme of the book is about. And, attached to that, I guess, is the various subsets of questions, such as what does it mean to be planetary? What does it mean to be human? So this is what it's, I guess, generally about. And because of the complexity and the globality, but I'd say the planetarity of this issue, I can only approach it through multiple discourses, multiple perspectives, including big history, transpersonal psychology, integral theory, comparative religion, and so on. But not only in terms of a multiplicity of perspectives, but trying to grope my way towards at least what could be called a transdisciplinary perspective. So a way of thinking, of speaking, writing, of meaning making that is able to render the disciplinary boundaries transparent so that we can start to participate more consciously in the deeper structures of meaning out of which the various discourses emerge. Because I think we need to, or some of us at least, who have the privilege, the luxury to do so, need to develop this kind of transdisciplinary way of thinking in order to do justice to the complexity and momentousness of our particular moment, our unique moment. So I guess I'd say that's one way of trying to describe what it's about.
Mm-hmm. So do you feel, in relation to this transdisciplinary nature of what you're trying to do you feel that when people sort of hone in on a single discipline to sort of to address an overarching problem, you feel maybe that immediately is going to run into problems which might actually be dangerous for us in the long run?
Yeah. Well, I guess, yeah. So if we take the the real geniuses and in some of the disciplines, like Carl Jung in psychology, so he styled himself as a humble empiricist, a mere psychologist, and so on. But of course, we know in reading Jung that he constantly pushed the boundaries of his discipline to the point where they intersected with philosophy and theology, and his dialogue with Wolfgang Pauli in physics and so on. So I think each discipline, if it's deepened into sufficiently, starts to become transparent to other disciplines. So I think it's fine to start from a particular discipline, but if we go deep enough, we'll inevitably want to and need to enter into dialogue with other disciplines, particularly around these so-called boundary concepts or boundary issues, the fundamental sort of paradigmatic assumptions, the root metaphors that structure every discipline. Once we get down to that level, then we start to participate in a deeper transdisciplinary field of meaning. And this makes possible true dialogue between the disciplines, and opens up the possibility for a way of thinking and speaking that is not tied to any one discipline, that is truly transdisciplinary. And this is what various forms of integral thinking try to do, as you know, whether it's in the form, with Jean Gebser or Ken Wilber or Sri Aurobindo or the many integral thinkers alive today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, leading out from Jung as someone we spoke about a little bit before, and you've now brought in, I will have to ask you the Hermetics question. So you can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick? Would Jung be one of those, or would?
Oh, I'd be honored. Yeah, it'd be great if Jung were there. Yeah, who else? Well, Jung, in terms of my own sort of spiritual mentors, I guess it'd be Jung, Hegel, and Sri Aurobindo, I guess. Jung, Hegel, and Aurobindo. Mm-hmm.
It's an extremely intellectually expansive room.
Mm. Mm. Yes.
So there was no clue where that conversation would end up.
Yeah, well, they all shared at least an intuition of and longing for, we might say, wholeness, for a meaning that is, to speak in Gebserian terms, diaphanous to or transparent to the mystery. But I think the mystery, at least for Hegel, can be named, can be spoken of coherently in terms of the whole or the absolute. For Sri Aurobindo, also there are words, as long as we don't cling to them and reduce the mystery. But Brahman. So whether it's Brahman, the absolute, the whole, or Jung's self, they all share this, what we could say is an intuition of wholeness, which of course begs the question: what is the whole, and what is wholeness? And this is what would be really fun to listen in or to participate in a conversation with these three figures, if you and I could do that.
Mm-hmm. Do you consider that this notion of the whole as important to how we're beginning to understand our relationship with the earth? That we shouldn't have this sort of fragmentary relationship of self, but there should be, in some sense, we need to draw in this philosophical notion of the whole.
Definitely. So when we reflect on this word whole or wholeness, the whole, we'll see that there are various sort of either cognates or sister concepts and intuitions, like the highest or ultimate. And in traditional language, at least in Western traditions, God, or in the Platonic tradition, the true, the good, the beautiful. So all of these words seem to be pointing to an intuition of I can only use other words now. I mean, this is the paradox of trying to speak about these things, but we call it the Tao, right? But the Tao, the whole, God, an intuition. Well, Paul Tillich talked about ultimate concern. So his definition of religion, or the religious impulse or religious feeling, was ultimate concern. And of course, that begs the question: well, what is truly ultimate? So here when we pursue this intuition and these words, we're driven to a series of related questions. What do we value most? What is the whole? Now we can pursue getting back to the whole. Of course, we can pursue that in a purely sort of spatial sense, or extroverted cosmological sense. We can talk about the cosmos as a whole. But in pragmatic terms, in sort of existential terms, I could say, well, my whole is my body, is my life, but obviously my body and my life is utterly dependent upon so many things: the food I eat, the people who raised me, the people that I'm constantly in interaction with, the air that I breathe, and so on. So my body is clearly not the whole. Now, we could extend this all the way to the cosmos, and that would be true. But in pragmatic existential terms, I think a case can be made that the whole that we ought to be most concerned with at the moment is the planet as a whole. And I like to call the planet Gaia. Mm-hmm. We could just say Earth if we want. Now, yes, Earth is dependent on the sun, and possibly other things, dependent upon the dance of gravitational interactions with all of the other planets and so on. That's true. And it's dependent upon the quantum vacuum, out of which everything is arising moment by moment. That's all true. But we can't really do anything about the quantum vacuum or the sun. But we can and need to face our existential common groundedness. As Latour likes to say, we are what, earthbound. Was it earthbound? We are the earthbound. Yeah. So we're Terran beings. We have a common origin, a common destiny, with this mysterious ball of living stuff that we call the earth. So this is what I've chosen in this book to focus my attention on in terms of the whole, in seeking for a common ground for the other inflections of what we might mean by the whole in terms of, let's say, highest value or the divine, or an existential ethical context. All of these other possibilities that we need to consider when we pursue the intuition of wholeness or the highest. I'm suggesting that we can do no better, and we are ethically bound, I think, to take on this common whole that participates us and in which we participate.
Well, I guess one could quite easily argue that people might say, well, what about what is value? It's entirely subjective. But of course, almost every single I would guess you'd argue every single subjective value relies on someone being alive. And of course, if if things go the way they seem to be in terms of climate change, then potentially not many people will be, because the thing which is upholding the potential for all value, the earth, will be gone, or will be at least uninhabitable. I think probably something needs to change in our way of talking about that as if we're the saviors. I mean, if we keep pushing climate change in the way that our effects seem to be, then the earth will still be here, but it just won't be for us anymore, right? It won't be our earth, or we won't be able to live with it in that certain sense. So I mean, perhaps that idea of the almost like that ownership aspect of the earth, of when we talk about the earth as if it's our home, like just for us, is this why you, in the book and of the title of the book, have a preference for the term Gaia, because it moves us away from that anthropocentric view of we're the savior in a way?
It's a great question. Yeah. Well, as you know, the intellectual elite and even the mainstream media has adopted the term anthropocene for the new geological age that we've entered into. Which is really striking. The first geological age in 4.6 or 4.8 billion years that takes on the name of a single species, and it's us, right? So the Earth has entered the age of the human, and I think there's a really good case for why that term is coherent. I mean, there's no doubt that all Earth systems now bear the indelible imprint of the human, the various geospheres. I mean, most notably in our time, the atmosphere, but the whole biosphere, which is unraveling as we speak. All of its organisms have trace elements of persistent organic pollutants and so on, even in the bottom of the ocean and in the Arctic and so on. So the biosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere bears the imprint of the human now. And as you were just saying, the fate of the rest of the Earth community now lies largely in the hands of humans in terms of what the human species is going to do over particularly the next decade or so. So there's a real, I think, truth to the idea of the Anthropocene. At the same time, to me, what this moment of the ongoing evolution of this planet is showing is that what the meaning of the human is being revealed as being integral to the life of this planet, not only in the sense that we now have a coherent story of human origins that goes not only all the way back to the origins of this planet itself. So we know that humans, like all members of the Earth community, are thoroughly earthly beings. And if this age is not to lead to the radical and perhaps permanent impoverishment of life on the planet in the way that you were describing, yes, there would still be a planet of some kind. There would probably still be some kind of life, but life as not only we have always known it, but as mammals have always known it, is disappearing in real time, in our time. So if we don't halt that, then there's a sense in which the human will have spelled the end of the period of the richest biodiversity on the planet. It might also entail our own extinction. So, if we really take that in, then it seems that our age is also an age where the human is being called to recognize not only our origins, but our ethical responsibility on a planetary scale to the whole Earth community. And the way that presumably we would manifest that responsibility is to reform our ways, reform our modes of being in the planet in such a way that they are conformal to or in harmony with the ways of the wider Earth community, which I call Gaia. Now, why do I prefer Gaia? I mean, Gaia to me, actually, it does on the one hand offset a kind of dissociated anthropocentrism in the way that you were describing by putting the emphasis on the wide Earth community rather than on the human. But the other reason why I like Gaia is that it encourages me and others who also like this term to feel into the nature of the whole in which we participate as something more than a mere collection of objects, which is still the felt sense that one might get when we speak of Earth systems, let's say. So the dominant way of speaking of the planet as a whole from a scientific point of view in our times is pretty much through Earth system science or the Earth system sciences. And they're marvelous. I mean, they are revealing day by day, giving us more and more detailed and nuanced pictures of the anatomy and physiology of this living planet. But they do so by necessarily through a process of objectification, quantification, and in a sense, reduction to an impersonal system. And, that's inevitable and useful for the information that it generates. On the other hand, it also can encourage the kind of purely instrumental and dissociated relationship that the human has developed toward the rest of the Earth community over the modern period, throughout the modern period. As you know, many philosophers have spoken about the evils of instrumental reason. So Thomas Berry, for instance, says that the great ethical task of our time is to convert our gaze, our attitude toward the Earth community from one that considers it as a collection of objects to one that beholds it as a communion of subjects. And this is, of course, is how indigenous communities and really all communities prior to the modern period more or less considered the world, our world, as a communion of subjects, which is to say that there was no firm dividing line between living and non-living, between personal and impersonal. In a sense, there was nothing truly impersonal in the experience of the world, insofar as what we called inanimate objects were considered to have a kind of internal life of their own. We still see this even in hypermodern Japan, for instance, where there are temples to used sewing needles, where instead of just throwing out the sewing needles are brought to a temple, and they're reverently thanked and offered to the temple, because even a sewing needle, which has performed this task for humans throughout its life, has its own kind of spirit. So all of this to say that to me, the word Gaia, which comes from the Greek, obviously the Greek goddess Gaia, recognizes that Earth has interiority, has a soul, we could say. The world has a soul. Now, what do we mean by a soul? I mean, we could just say at the very least what it means is that the Earth and everything in her, I will say, has intrinsic value, has interiority. Not merely use value, but intrinsic value, interiority, which invites an attitude of participation and mutuality, what Martin Buber, called an I-thou relationship rather than an I-it relationship. So this to me is one of the virtues of using the word Gaia, is that instead of simply the earth. I mean, I love the earth. The word earth is great, particularly when you say earth, not only the earth, but just earth. But Gaia can do more work in the direction of encouraging us to find alternatives to the disembodied, objectifying, instrumentalist gaze, which has become so endemic to the dominant worldview, and that I still participate and enact even in my daily life. So that was a bit long, but
no, it's great. I mean, I have sort of this question which I've asked many guests who are dealing with this topic, which I think none of them have ever said this is exactly why they think this is, but as your title puts it brilliantly, on the threshold, we're closing in, when it's not thousands of years in the future and we've worked it out in due time. We're at the limitrophy, in a way. We're on that point where it's like, okay, you need to make a decision now, right? You haven't got time anymore. And the funny thing, I guess, that's peculiar that's happening, as you said, the mainstream media has taken up on this. Academics have taken. Everyone really knows about it, and everyone knows their place within it in a way, and everyone can see the statistics and the results of it, and everyone knows the reality of it, I guess, in a certain sense of, well, if we keep doing what we're doing, then things aren't going to work out very nice, and none of us are going to be able to have a place to live, and many of us probably won't live. So the question really is, why don't we change? Why don't we change? Why do we still just not do anything? And the things that we do seem to be almost veils to just make ourselves feel better, even though they haven't really changed too much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'd love to hear why you think maybe.
I personally think, if you're genuinely asking, I personally think that years of what would be considered modernity has compressed the individual's time preference shorter and shorter and shorter, and certain societal changes have made us no longer perhaps at a certain point we used to think what would my great grandchildren want, and then maybe our grandchildren, and then our children, and now what do I want? And now it's no longer what do I want in 50 years, it's what do I want now. So I'd say our time preference just on a societal level has been completely compressed, so that all we care about is, and I think I'm not blaming people for this, because we're in a lot of people in the West are in a very malicious and coercive capitalist world where you're like, I've got to pay my rent, this month.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, you don't want to be thinking about, are my actions going to, are they complicit in destroying the environment, because you've got personal worries to think about. But I think that would be my theory on that, I guess. How about yourself?
Yeah, no, I like that. I agree with that. Yeah, I mean, we've certainly been, I say the we, who's the we? Well, those of us who are, well, everybody's embedded in one way or another in industrial growth society and in late capitalist society, which, where, as you know, everything is commodified and is organized in a way that, benefits materially and in terms of power. It's very unequal in the way of who it benefits in terms of power. Yeah. So we're conditioned. Yeah, we're conditioned to. I mean, on the one hand, we didn't evolve to have long-term views. I mean, as mammals, our time sense, evolved to be sensitive to, on the one hand, the immediate environment, or to circadian rhythms, or to the patterns of repeating seasons. Pretty much, that was it. And then, eventually, a certain group of individuals in all societies learned to track much longer cycles, usually in connection with the stars. But these were ever recurring cycles. And I guess what started to change dramatically in the modern period is that the rate of change in terms of the effects of human on their built environment, in terms of changes in patterns of cultural production, so both material and cultural production, the rate of change started to accelerate, and as you know, has gone exponential in our time. So, and that has been catalyzed by, amplified by, encouraged by, of course, capitalism and industrial growth society, which depends upon the increasing rate of producing new stuff to be consumed, to be bought and sold, in order to continue to enrich those who are who privately own and control the means of production and so on. So yeah, that there's so much momentum to industrial growth society, which is embedded in just the modern mentality, which is forward-looking. That we didn't evolve to have the perception of the kind of time pressures that we're experiencing now, or to anticipate changes on the order of the planet on a planetary scale, or we could even say like cosmologically significant time events, such as the changing of a geological age. We're the first mammals actually to experience the shift of a geological age, certainly the first humans. So we didn't evolve to have that organ of perception. And this is what we're being called to do now. And it's paradoxical, because as you say, we've been so conditioned for our attention to be limited to, if you're one of the 1% to the next quarter in terms of the market and so on, or like most of us, just day to day, or week to week, or month to month. But how are we going to do this when we're so conditioned? And yet this is what we're being called to do. So there's this paradoxical tension. I mean, right now, as you know, this movie "Don't Look Up" is really, so many people have seen it, and it's in the news and so on, and it portrays well, as a satire, this sudden, as the French say, prise de conscience, a kind of like galvanization of the collective consciousness on the part of people who are normally only understandably preoccupied with their private lives, their private sphere, the day to day or the week to week, and suddenly we are being forced to look up to an event, the nature of which the Earth has not seen in 66 million years. So, this is the paradox of our time, and it's not clear that obviously we are doing it. You and I are doing it. Many people are doing it, and maybe that's, maybe that's enough in one sense. I mean, if what's being called for is the emergence of a new organ of perception on a planetary scale, in one sense, it has happened. It's happening. Will it be enough to allow us to avert the worst case scenario? That's far from clear. But that's where we are. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess it's this notion of, like a compression of time, in the sense that many of us just live in the next hour, the next day, would be a good place to bring in, you talk of big history. So what is big history, and what role does it play in this, the initiation you speak of, and how can it sort of help us, in the next 10, 20, 50 years?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so big history is a movement that is devoted to, you could say, inserting the human story or human history within the wider context of the history or the evolution of the cosmos, and particularly the evolution of Earth. So it's big in that sense, and there are many examples of big historians. The field was sort of initiated by Christensen. I can't remember his first name now. David Christensen, but there are many examples of big historians, and we could think of even Carl Sagan with the Cosmos series, who famously put the whole time span of the evolution of the cosmos on a calendar year, and showed that the whole human story takes place on the last days, December 31st of that calendar year, pretty close to midnight, sort of thing,
Isn't it like six minutes or something like that?
Geez, I'm trying to remember exactly. It's shockingly.
Actually,
short.
I think it might even be 6 seconds or something.
Well, yeah, I certainly, if you take the whole modern period or the historical period, yeah, it's very, very short. I mean, I've gone on these Gaia walks with one of your compatriots, a dear friend of mine, Stephen Harding at Schumacher College, and he takes his students and people on these walks along the coast of Devon, a 4.6 kilometer walk, which stands for the 4.6 billion years of the history of this planet. And you're walking for a couple of hours, and for the first hour or so, there's really not much happening. But he'll stop occasionally and tell you, okay, at this point, we have the first nucleated cells, and you just keep on walking. And at a certain point, things really start accelerating particularly after the Cambrian explosion 500 million years ago. But it's not until you get to the very end of the walk in Dartmouth where he takes out a measuring tape, and you've got just the last 3 or 4 centimeters of that 4.6 kilometer walk. And that's the whole historical period, basically. So that's an example of big history. And, one response would be, as Carl Sagan used to, to talk about the billions and billions of galaxies and so on, is to perhaps give a sense of the insignificance of the human, both spatially and temporally within this larger history of the cosmos. And that's true from a purely quantitative point of view. But it's clearly not true from an existential point of view, or I would say qualitative point of view, on this planet, at least, since the human actually, as we see with the idea of the Anthropocene, the human represents that phase or moment of Gaia that is deciding, whether consciously or unconsciously, the fate of the rest of complex life on the planet. So, most big history, I think, is still mesmerized by the quantitative vastness, and focuses on understandably, on these large timelines. But other big historians like Brian Swimme, Thomas Berry, we could even say Teilhard de Chardin, is another sort of lineage of big history that we might say is deep history instead of big history. And this is one that from the start recognizes that we're not only dealing with quantities and collections of objects organized in systems, we are dealing with that, but we're dealing with something that is from the beginning ensouled or intrinsically meaningful, full of meaning, and that produces meaning right from the beginning, whether that beginning is the Big Bang or at the smallest scale of a subatomic particle. There's some kind of soul dimension or interiority or consciousness or prehension, to speak in Whiteheadian terms, goes all the way down spatially and temporally. And the thing about our moment now is that we are at that moment, at least on this planet, which is the only one that we have any direct acquaintance with, where that dimension of meaning or soul or intrinsic value is being raised to the level of consciousness on a planetary scale. It's always been there, of course. I mean, the first cells had it. Whales have it. I mean, all members of the Earth community have it. But here we are in this beginning of 2022, in the accelerating phase of what I call the Gaia Anthropocene, which I prefer personally to Anthropocene, where we are being called to wake up together to what has always been the case, but which is now come to a moment of reckoning, which can also be a moment of celebration, but a moment of reckoning that is calling for all kinds of things, for justice on a planetary scale, for courage, for mourning of what's already lost and what we're bound to lose. So this is our moment, which I think big historians have a responsibility to highlight, along with the merely quantitative vastness of the story. I'm encouraging them to emphasize the depth dimension, and more particularly to take that depth dimension, that qualitative dimension, to the point where we recognize that there's a moral imperative as deep historians or as big historians, as any kind of public intellectual or professor, anybody who has a voice. There's an ethical imperative now, I think, to take a stand on matters that will bear upon the fate of the Earth community. I
mean, that's very interesting, because it seems that the planetary initiation that you're speaking of, I mean, one thing that I quite liked when, we were speaking of Jung, and it's actually strange that Jung's being brought back in here. When I spoke to Murray Stein about Jung, he said near the end of our conversation that in a way, I have to be a bit vague here because I don't want to misquote him, but he said, in a way, Jungian practice is an initiatory tradition. You know, you are being initiated into something that isn't just how it's often seen as just this psychological thing. And it seems that this planetary initiation that you're writing of and speaking of is very much existential in exactly the same way that people are going to have to deal almost with some form of like Gaian trauma, where they have to overcome something which they don't want to see and have to admit to a lot of things they probably don't want to deal with. Would I be on the right track there, or have I stretched that a bit too far?
No, I think so, for sure. Yeah, I mean, Jung, on the one hand, stressed the importance of the individual and how the transformation of the collective, if there were to be such a transformation, needed to happen with the individual, and we each need to go through our own initiation or individuation, as he called it. On the other hand, Jung also saw, especially toward the end of his life, that something was happening on a planetary scale. I mean, you see it clearly in his late work, Answer to Job, or Modern Man in Search of a Soul, or and so on. And he even apparently saw on his deathbed, he scribbled this little note with a strange line, a waving line, and the words, "the last 50 years of humanity," which would have brought us to around 2012, strangely enough. So he saw that there was something happening on a planetary scale that involved a kind of collective near-death experience. And, yes, we are all, in a sense, going through it now, and those who will be here will go through it, but obviously in different ways. I mean, I feel, I'm extremely privileged that I haven't had to, and for now, I don't have to worry about, going hungry. I mean, that could change, right? The supply chain could be disrupted. We could have, a fairly precipitous collapse of industrial civilization as we've known it, in which case I might very well go hungry. But for now, I'm part of a very, privileged class of people who don't have to worry about hunger or, a roof over my head, or being shot at, and so on. So if things continue along the path of collapse and unraveling, the people who are already suffering now are going to suffer more, and more who have not been suffering are going to suffer more. And many of these people won't have understandably, the luxury to contemplate what's going on a planetary scale. They'll be preoccupied with their own existential dilemma. So that's why I really think those of us now who do have the luxury and the privilege have a deep ethical responsibility to turn our awareness, our discourse, our behavior in the world to the best of our ability in the direction of cultivating a truly planetary awareness, a planetary ethic that, however we're positioned, might have some kind of beneficial effect on policy, on the communities in which we're embedded, and so on, to make what looks like an inevitable collapse a softer landing, and hopefully also create sort of cultural seeds or arcs that will survive the transition, that will cross the threshold and allow for something to regrow, something to regenerate on the other side, that will be more consciously and coherently in harmony with the ways of Gaia. So this is.
Are you optimistic?
On a feeling level, in terms of do I see us? I still feel that it's possible to avoid the worst case scenario. Put it that way. Okay. And the worst case scenario is just precipitous fall, precipitous collapse, and unstoppable unraveling of complex life. I think I feel that, I don't know about optimistic, but I still feel it's possible to avoid that. And, but I am increasingly convinced that we are heading for collapse of industrial civilization. How quickly that'll happen, whether we can make it a soft landing and have something more regenerative on the other side, I think we don't know. I think it's still possible, but as you know from reading the book, even if somebody could show me a kind of precognitive video showing that it's not possible and that it's all for naught, I wouldn't believe that it's all for naught, because I'm convinced that certain things are intrinsically good and true and beautiful and worth doing, regardless of how they might turn out in the future. So, this is really the ethical stance, the psycho-spiritual ethical stance that I was aiming for in this book, particularly toward the end, is to help myself and those who might have similar intuitions contact and stabilize a form of consciousness that can find the necessary courage, determination, even joy in continuing to walk forward in what appears to be an ever darkening dark night, ever deepening dark night of the soul. But I think we would need another session to explore this together. I think. I think your podcasts are only an hour, right?
Well, we can keep going. I do have one sort of question that we could possibly make it the final question, but it's quite it might be expansive, because at the moment I'm in the process of reading Facing Gaia by Latour and doing episodes on Latour's work. And, I imagine really in contemporary philosophy, he's one of the few that's really using that term, which is it's a strange term to use, really. And but in your book, you do have a critique of Latour's conception of Gaia. So I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on where you think perhaps he's gone a little bit wrong.
First of all, I am delighted and I applaud Latour for the courage that it must have taken for him to adopt that term. I really think it's brilliant that he did so, and truly courageous. He has encouraged people, philosophers, thinkers in general, who might not otherwise have done so, to think in terms of Gaia, to take on this complex and existentially charged task of thinking through and with this planetary moment. So I'm profoundly grateful to him for that. And, I obviously he's brilliant, and he's so clever in his writing. But I did find myself taking issue with several of his statements, particularly, to me, seems like I was going to say irrational in the sense of an a priori commitment to commitment against any kind of thinking or discourse that appeals to wholeness or the whole or system. This is, as you know, this is very, very popular ever since Kierkegaard actually reacted to the lectures by one of Hegel's students that he was attending, and that anti-Hegelianism that we see beginning with Kierkegaard, well, Schopenhauer actually, but Kierkegaard in terms of a rejection of the impulse to systematize, to think in terms of systems. We see it particularly after the Second World War, understandably, because of the contamination of the idea of the whole by the experience of totalitarianism and fascism. So I get it; it's understandable, and I think it's a healthy attitude to keep in mind. It's a necessary critique to consider. As Adorno said, the whole is the non-truth. Well, I get that, and I think that's certainly true of certain inflections of the concept of the whole, certain expressions of the impulse towards wholeness. On the other hand, if we're talking just about Earth or Gaia, the sciences to which Latour appeals and with which he's in such creative dialogue are called Earth system science. The science is based upon the conviction that Earth is a system, or at least is a system of systems. So a system is really just, what is a system? A system is a concept we use for a conviction, an experience and a conviction that whatever it is we are considering is coherent. It doesn't mean that it's coherent in every last detail, or that however we formulate the coherence is static and can never be revised. But there is a conviction that what we are considering is coherent. It is a whole. It makes sense as a whole, that we need to consider it in its wholeness. And of course, this begs the question, well, what is the whole? We need to constantly interrogate ourselves on, is this really the whole? Are we leaving something out? Are we reducing the complexity of what we're looking at? And this is where the critique of a kind of totalitarian holism, I think, is necessary and useful. But Latour, as far as I can see, takes that critique and just makes it a blind assumption that there is no such thing as a system. Gaia is not a system, he says. And he also says that, he diminishes and denigrates the idea of the soul, the world soul. Gaia is not a system, doesn't have a world soul. Well, why? What I'd like to know why. What is the justification for that claim? He's free to have these convictions, that's fine, but they just seem incoherent to me, and also not particularly helpful.
Do you think it's important to understand Gaia as in a systematic sense, as a means to sort of prod at the whole?
Yeah. So I mean, in terms of so when we speak in systems, we're obviously using, in Jung's terms, the thinking function. We're using conceptual categories, we need to do that if we're going to think coherently. So if coherence is a value that we treasure, if we are striving for coherence in our thinking and in our discourse, then I think, as Hegel rightfully saw, our thinking and our discourse needs to take the form of a system. So only in the form of a system can discourse or thinking be truly coherent. Now, if you don't mind incoherence, then you don't need a system. Okay. So we can think incoherently, and in that way, we don't need a system. That's thinking, but we can also. There are different modes of consciousness and discourse that are not tied to concepts that are more metaphorical or more symbolic. We could make the distinction between also prose and poetry, or the prosaic mode and the poetic mode, or as McGilchrist does in his work, between right and left brain modes of meaning making, for instance. So the systems view, the thinking view, is one necessary mode, but the poetic, the symbolic is another, or the aesthetic, we could say, is also equally necessary for me, and in some ways is actually primary. It's certainly existentially primary. If the aesthetic mode, as Whitehead recognizes, actually goes all the way down to the elemental occasions, the drops of experience, each of which is a prehension or a form of feeling, then if we honor that mode and see it as equally necessary, then speaking in terms of systems, to me, is not enough. I need to speak also in terms of souls and persons, or spirits, or other words that we could give that allow me to experience my world and what inhabits the world, not as a collection of objects, as Thomas Berry says, but as a communion of subjects. I mean, that's actually speaking conceptually, but it's a way of speaking conceptually that points us in the direction of the more poetic or symbolic or enchanted mode of being in the world. So Latour seems to reject, both the conceptual route toward wholeness via system, as well as the poetic mode towards enchantment. And I don't know why, I mean, I can see why he might want to do it. I don't know why he wants to do it personally, but it's certainly in line with the prejudices, the dominant prejudices of the academic elite, which reject all forms of totalization on the one hand, and also reject taking spirit and soul seriously.
Well, he's also Catholic, so I don't know where the Catholic Church would stand on the earth having a soul. I don't know if that's
soul of the world. Yeah,
I don't know if that's compatible with
that's a good
Catholicism.
Question. Yeah,
so it might be a practical means that's sort of related back to the mystery.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, Teilhard de Chardin was Catholic too, and even rocks had a soul for him.
I don't know enough about unfortunately don't know enough about the theology yet to really comment on whether or not. I mean, he was. It's true. He would be considered heretical in some circles. So, yeah, there's big C and small C Catholic, I guess. Yeah, and well, Latour is also on the sort of the smaller C because he's also most definitely not sort of orthodox in that sense. So there.
That's true. But does that make sense to you? What I just said about Latour? I mean, you're.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean it's also not so much a problem. I mean, it's an interesting way of writing about things, but it's something that crops up in his earlier books that sort of a philosophical move away from a distrust of coherence equally is a bit tyrannical, because then you're left like stranded in the ocean, right? Like, well, we need something to grasp onto, which is the problem I had with not a problem, but it was like I said, it's an interesting way of philosophizing in his book, We Have Never Been Modern. Which theorizes that things like terms such as conceptual terms such as capital E economy or nature or these things, we've now revered these as gods, but they aren't actually these things, which is it's very interesting. But as you're doing that, you're removing the anchors which allowed you to move around and sort of see where you are. So it's once we've deconstructed this sort of agreed upon capital N conception of nature, but what are we now left with? And then as you said, you can quite quickly end up in incoherence from that. So you have to play it quite carefully. And I guess your critique would be that you don't always end up somewhere where you have something to really work with.
Yeah. And so that's why I'm in recognizing that we may not be able to get to any kind of consensus philosophically on these issues, we can at least agree pragmatically and existentially about what I call the concrete universal is, Gaia, this planet. I mean, just in purely pragmatic existential terms, it's something that we have in common, and the common is what defines the universal, right? Which is which we can approach either as system or as
something else. Something else.
That's
the problem we're talking about, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I can completely sympathize. Well, that seems like we've covered a lot of the book. Is there anything in the text that you feel we haven't covered that you'd like to add in?
Not really. I mean, there's so many directions we could go in. I appreciate your interest in the text. I appreciate. I'm grateful that we had this time together, and I just hope we have another opportunity to continue the conversation.
Well, yeah. Would you? I mean, there is much more to talk about in the book. Would you like to come on for like a part 2 about the book?
Oh, sure. That'd be fun.
Okay. I guess we should say whereabouts. I mean, it's published by Revelor under the imprint of Integral Imprint, yeah, which is under or within Revelor. So, if you want to buy the book, I assume it'll definitely be on Revelor's website, and I assume it will also be in all those other nefarious places. Which, if you bought it from them, they're not going to help the cause we've been talking about. So
that's true. Yeah.
So yeah.
Your local bookstore can certainly order it. Yeah.
Exactly. But I mean, one question as well that I always like to ask is: Are you working on anything else at the moment?
I just finished a translation of a long essay by my mentor and friend Edgar Morin. I just finished that, but no, right now I am lying fallow. And I'm concentrating on my daily Japanese study, and waiting until I get some promptings about what, if anything, would be worthwhile to write.
That sounds good. That sounds like a nice place to be.
Yeah.
Well, Sean Kelly, sorry. Thanks very much.
Thank you, James. Take care.